display that. It will be a great.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you one and all. Thank you all the speakers, the participants who are here. I think many of them will be joining slowly to know about the participant. Many of them will be, most of them are doctors and pre-hospital care workers. Most working in the hospitals are at the pre-hospital care level. And I purposely wanted an anesthetist also because most of the COVID patients, they land up in what you call it as a respiratory problem, and the anesthetists are supposed to be the one who take care of the respiratory things. So apart from Dr. Sudha, the medical oncologist, I requested Dr. Vibha and Dr. Prardhana to be a part of this webinar. I request our medical director, Dr. Ramana Rao, to start the session, to give a welcome message and send some few interesting things which he wanted to mention before the start of the session. Over to you, Dr. Ramana.
Very good afternoon to all of you to a very, very special session today. As a series, we have been doing these webinars and trying to specialities. Now the world is noticing COVID in a very, very different manner, though it is one of those events which happens once in a century. If you have noticed what WHO has mentioned today, that the epidemic COVID is not only affecting the elderly age group, as in the initial months. Now people in 20s, 30s and 40s are also affected. So that makes a very different approach we need to face and create a healthcare system. And the leading global experts are also mentioning that while we are focusing on the measures of testing, tracing and treatment for the COVID, we need to be very careful about what happens to the non-COVID situations. In particular, the non-communicable diseases. We have very recently learned that the cardiovascular diseases, particularly the stroke and heart attacks, are not being reported. And one of the things which today we'll be considering as a part of the non-communicable disease is the cancers and malignancies. We as EMS professionals, we know that there will be a fatal road traffic accident every 4 minutes in India. It may be a big news for all of you that every 8 minutes, one person in India is dying because of cancer. Try to estimate the burden of disease we have in India. My information says that there are about 2.25 million cancer patients, and every year about 11 lakh new what we call incidences are happening in our country. And about 7 lakh people are also dying. So when we talk about the malignancies, it is very, very important that it is also a huge burden in our communities. As emergency medical service organization, like Dr. Raja was mentioning, that we do not have a direct cancer as our chief complaint, but we have chief complaints like shortness of breath. People may manifest in the form of fever. They may manifest in the form of altered level of consciousness. There will be a complication and they will be seeking our services. So when I was reviewing the literature, what is there which I can share? A curtain raiser. The second professional body of cancer has come out with a very crisp checklist which need to be there with every cancer patient, and every paramedic who works in the ambulance should also have a fairly good idea about that. Now I will request Dr. Raja Narsingh Rao to open that slide for all of us.
Is it visible for you, the slide? No?
Not at this point of time. But nevertheless, while Dr. Raja will facilitate to...
How about now? Are you able to see the slide?
No, sir.
Are you able to see the slide, Anand?
No, sir. No.
Nevertheless, I can just run over those points. So it is in the form of a checklist and it is given to every cancer patient in US. And this checklist is very pertinent to the people who work in the ambulances, because I was telling you last time that in many of the developed countries, the paramedics are going and giving injections for COVID also in many of the world countries.
Are you able to see the slide now?
Yes,
Yes,
Dr.
sir.
Raja. Yes,
Okay.
thank you so much, right? The checklist, and it is an emergency checklist, and it is developed by the professional body of oncology from America. And there's a very strong message for most of the paramedics who are participating in that. And I'm sure the specialists will mull over the other details, which are very, very important for today's discussion. And I'm sure that it will be a phenomenal learning experience. The first point says that every cancer patient should be informed about what are the danger signs, like what we do for a pregnant woman, what we do for a patient with diabetes, what do we do for a patient with hypertension. Same danger signs, what could be a cancer patient, at what time they need to seek the service of nurse, are very clearly mentioned. The second one is that the cancer patients are advised to keep 1 week of drugs in a plastic container, plastic envelope or a bag, so that if something like what is happening in Warangal and other places, the country is getting flooded, so the drugs are available for the cancer patient. The third point is every cancer patient should also have a first aid kit. It may be very simple as like anybody's guess. So one is about danger signs. The second is about having drugs for 1 week. The third point is having a very small first aid kit in case they have a cut, or they will be able to take care of that. The fourth one is should have at least stock of 3 days food to meet with any eventualities in the environment or circumstantial, and he may not be, or she may not be able to go and pick up those groceries from the nearby stores. Very interesting is that all cancer patients should also have another telephone number. It is called in case of emergency. In case of emergency, it's called an ICE concept, right? So this is a very good thing. I'm sure that EMTs, when we go to the communities and interact with them, we should also propagate this concept of ICE concept. In case of emergency, what is the emergency number? For example, if I have an emergency, I will also always mention Dr. Raja Narsingh Rao's number. So such sort of an approach should be there at the community level. And they should also have a mobile connectivity, like on the top itself, they should have, in case of emergency, they should be dial this number 108 in India. And tomorrow, after 2 years, it will be 112 number. And lastly, the seventh point, it says that the patient of cancer should have a written document that what kind of cancer it is, what is the stage, what is the mode of treatment, it is chemotherapy, and what are the things. So there should be a written document. These 7 points will have a very important what we follow in pre-care or emergency. It's called preparedness. If there is a preparedness, the emergency will not have its bad consequences. So in the COVID pandemic, it is very important for us that though cancer is a very long-term sequelae may be having, but its acute manifestations are very, very important for people who work in the emergency medical services. That means those who work in the ambulances, the emergency rooms, and those people who are all at the cutting edge level interacting with the communities as such, because we are non-emergency centralized call center like 104 helpline. So Dr. Raja, thank you for asking me to do this initial curtain raiser, and all the special speakers today. And
Thank you, Dr. Ramna Rao. So I just wanted to mute all of you because there's some disturbance. Now we start with Dr. Sudha Sinha. Everybody know about Dr. Sudha Sinha. She is a medical oncologist. As of now, she's working at CARE Hospital. Actually, I wanted to share her. I'd like to share her CV. If I'm able to do that, I'll be very happy. Okay. Are you able to see the screen? Are you able to see the screen?
Yes, sir.
Yes.
Okay, thanks. So Dr. Sudha Sinha, she is right now working in CARE Hospital as a medical oncologist. She is a student of Gandhi Medical College, and she did her internal medicine in US and also fellowship in oncology. And after her fellowship in oncology, she came back to uh, India and to Hyderabad, and she's worked in M&J and all many of the reputed hospital. M&J Hospital, which was the one of the biggest cancer institute. And apart from that, she has worked in CARE, Continental, then Citizen Hospital, many of the hospital. But presently, she's working at CARE Hospital as one of the clinical director and HOD medical oncology CARE Hospital. This is a background. She, on her own interest, she was practicing oncology there, but she, on her own interest to serve the country, she has come back, and I'm very happy that she has visited our GVK MRI once, and she gave a very good lecture. That is the reason why I wanted to be a part of this particular session today. Now, Dr. Sudha, with this introduction, there's a long introduction. It takes long time if I tell about all your presentations, your research activities and all. Thank you once again, be a part of this webinar. And over to you, Dr. Vibha. I'll unmute you. Just, are you muted, Dr. Vibha? Dr. Sudha?
Yes, sir. I'm unmuted. You'll have to let me share the screen.
Okay, I'll just I've put it on share screen, but I don't know whether you are able to open it or not. I'm not sure, but again I'll type your screen sharing. So that is the reason I told I wanted your slides.
Yeah, I've sent you my slides also.
Yeah, I'll just again open it up, your slides. If I'm not able to do, then we'll. COVID and oncology. This is cancer. I think this are your slides. We'll just see. Yeah, are you able to see the slides now?
Yeah, if you can put it
Can
in
you
the slideshow.
move the slides now on your own? I have put it to share the slides to you.
No, sir. It is still disabled.
Okay. So okay, sorry. I'll be changing the slides then.
Okay, fine. All right. So today, thank you very much for that kind introduction.
Actually, Dr. Sudha, I have gone through this PPT, and most of the questions which I wanted to ask are being covered in this PPT. That is the reason I am not asking them, because they have given me 25 to 26 questions which they wanted you to answer. But
right.
The questions like what precautions cancer patient and family of cancer patient needs, what is the role of radiotherapy, all these things are put in your slide. That is the reason why I am not putting the questions directly. I am asking you to present the PPT. Thank you, Dr. Sudha. Please carry on.
Thank you, sir, for that kind introduction. And it was nice to have presented an EMRA very long ago, and I'm glad to be back. Sir had sent me a few questions on the kinds of topics that we have to cover. And I'm not sure if we'll have time for everything, but I'll mainly concentrate on the issue right now, which is cancer patients and the COVID-19 situation that we are all living with. So the first question, and most of my patients also ask me this, is that are they at an increased risk for COVID-19? And we don't have very good data, but it looks like cancer patients might have a lower immunity and might be at an increased risk of getting COVID-19 compared to a normal patient who does not have cancer or any other comorbidities. So there were 1 or 2 studies that were done, and cancer was one of the risk factors for an increased risk of corona. So the biggest problem, I think, is how do we measure immunity? And there is no particular test which will tell me whether my patient has low immunity or high immunity. So, but from the studies, like I said, we know that patients with diabetes, with cancer, heart disease, they all have a higher risk of um, getting COVID. So in cancer patients, there are some patients whom we think are at a higher risk than other cancer patients. And if we go to the next slide,
This is a slide. The next one,
yeah, that one, sir. Yeah. So if we go to, yeah, sorry, sir, one minute.
previous one.
I'm not able to, one second. Yeah. So when I see patients with cancer, there are two types of cancer patients. One is a patient who has a history of cancer but has finished all treatment. So this would be a patient who has had surgery, finished their chemotherapy, radiation, and is maybe on some hormonal therapy or not on any treatment at all. The other one is a patient who is receiving active cancer therapy. So these are patients who are on chemotherapy or on radiation. Today, luckily, we have a lot more options in cancer treatment. So we have patients on hormonal therapy, on immunotherapy, targeted therapy. So when we, all these patients are not at equal risk of getting cancer, getting COVID. Next slide, sir. So the patients, the hormonal therapy that we commonly see patients get is in breast cancer, where we have patients with tamoxifen or aromatase inhibitors and fulvestrant. And these medicines as such do not reduce immunity or cause low blood counts. We also have a group of medicines called tyrosine kinase inhibitors, specially used in lung cancer patients. And again, as such, they do not decrease the immunity of the patient, but there is some data showing that patients who are on who have lung cancer itself, that is a increased risk factor for COVID-19. The third is patients who are on oral chemotherapy. So these patients are different from patients with breast cancer or on tamoxifen or aromatase inhibitors. So when you go to see a patient who's called with an emergency and you ask them, are you on any treatment for cancer? And they say, my chemotherapy radiation is over, I'm only on tablets. It is important to know what kind of tablets that patient is taking. The patient could be taking a simple hormonal tablet which does not decrease their immunity. They might also be taking a tablet like capecitabine or etoposide, an oral chemotherapy tablet, which might decrease their immunity. So if we see who are the patients at the highest risk, these are, one is patients who are actively receiving chemotherapy or who have received chemotherapy in the last 3 months. Patients who are receiving extensive radiation. So these might be patients even with a bone marrow transplant where we do a total body irradiation. Patients who have had multiple radiation histories in the past and have come back again for an RT treatment. These patients are at a higher risk. Then patients, obviously those who have had a bone marrow transplant in the last 6 months, especially if they've had an allo bone marrow transplant, then they're definitely very immunocompromised. These are patients who are on steroids or who might be on some medication for graft versus host disease. So, and their immunity might not have come back to the normal levels. These are also patients who have to be technically on some kind of a vaccination schedule. So many of our allo BMT patients, we wait a year before we give them vaccines for tetanus and measles. So these patients, not just COVID, but they're at risk for all sorts of infection. Like I mentioned before, patients with lung cancer are at higher risk. Now, there are some patients with hematologic malignancies, even if they are not on treatment, they are at a higher risk for infections. And one is patients with CLL, where we see hypogammaglobulinemia and low IgG levels. These patients are at a higher risk of infections. Patients with myeloma and lymphoma also we see a higher risk. So when you see a patient in the emergency, not all cancer patients are equal. One is the group of patients who have already finished their chemotherapy and radiation and all treatments. The second is the patients who are actively receiving the treatment. Even amongst patients who are actively receiving the treatment, the risk will differ based on, are they receiving chemotherapy, Are they receiving radiation? Is this a bone marrow transplant patient? Is this a patient who has a hematologic disorder? So I just thought I'll present 2 or 3 cases that we have seen in the last 3 months, and how we make decisions for treatment when we see a patient with cancer, especially in the current situation. So the first patient is a 70-year-old patient with high blood pressure, hypothyroidism, but otherwise quite active. She had a history of a lump in the breast for 3 months and no other comorbidities. She underwent a right modified radical mastectomy at another place, and then she came to see me. The pathology report showed an infiltrating ductal carcinoma, which was 2.5 centimeters in size. The lymph nodes were not involved, and or for breast cancer patients, we type the type of breast cancer that they have. So we do markers called ER, PR, and HER2. All 3 markers were negative. These are patients who are at a higher risk of recurrence compared to other types of breast cancer. We did a marker called Ki-67, where again in this patient it was high, again showing that the risk of recurrence might be high. So the question was, do we give chemotherapy or not for this patient? And in a normal non-COVID world, we would have recommended that she take chemotherapy. So we discussed with the family, and here if you see in this graph, it shows that if the patient had received only surgery, at the end of 10 years, only 54% of these patients are alive. What if we gave chemotherapy to this patient? What is the additional benefit that we will get? And in this patient, the chemotherapy would have increased her survival rate from 54 to 59%. Now, all our textbooks and our training tell us that if there is any treatment that improves your chance of survival by about 5%, you should be recommending the treatment to that particular patient. But today in this corona world, when we discussed about it, we felt that given her older age and her comorbidities, she might be at a higher risk of a COVID infection after the chemotherapy was given. So after a long discussion, it was decided that the patient will not get any chemotherapy and we will just keep her on a surveillance. So this is how, because of the current situation we are in, the choice was made to go more towards not giving treatment rather than giving treatment. The second patient is, this was a 32-year-old patient I saw 3 months ago. And this patient, what happened was that she was having a lump in her breast since December. And she saw a physician who did an ultrasound. They said it looked like a fibroadenoma and no follow-up was required. But the lump kept increasing in size. But because of the lockdown, she was very scared to go out of the house and meet any doctor. Finally, in the first week of May, when she developed lesions in her axilla also, she developed lymph nodes in the axilla, and it was becoming painful for her to keep her hand close by. So she decided to go back to the physician. And this time the breast mass had increased in size. It was 5 centimeters in size, and axillary nodes were also palpable. So she underwent a biopsy that confirmed the diagnosis of cancer. So in this patient, the question is, what will we do for her? Do we give her chemotherapy? Do we take her for surgery? And is the risk of COVID too much to give her any kind of a treatment? She was young. She did not have any comorbidities. And again, if we look at this patient, if we did only surgery for her, her survival would have been only 30% chances of survival at the end of 10 years. But by giving chemotherapy and by giving trastuzumab, we are increasing the survival rate to 57 to 60%. So we're actually doubling her survival rate by giving the treatment. So in her case, it looks like the benefit of treatment is much more than the risk of any infection from COVID. And the hope is that even if she did develop an infection, given her young age and lack of comorbidities, we will be able to get her through that period also. So we decided to go for chemotherapy for her. And I'm happy to say that after 4 cycles of treatment, she has responded well and she is doing all right. And we are planning surgery after 2 months for her. So she's currently undergoing treatment and so far doing okay. This is another patient who is an older patient of mine. So I have been treating her for the past 2 years. She is a patient with an ovarian cancer. He had an extensive ovarian tumor, and we had initially given her done surgery and 6 cycles of chemotherapy. She also had severe problems with chemotherapy, developing severe neuropathy, not able to walk. It took her 2 months to almost recover from the neuropathy from the treatment. So eventually she was doing okay, but unfortunately she again developed abdominal pain in March of this year. And when we repeated a PET CT scan, she had small peritoneal deposits and inguinal lymph nodes. So normally again for a patient like this, we might have considered giving chemotherapy injections. But given the corona situation, what we did for her was that we started her on oral chemotherapy, which is slightly less immunosuppressive, and the chances of blood counts going down are low. So after a discussion with the family, we started her on this etoposide injections, and patient is doing fine. It's been 5 months, and recent scans also showed that she's responded very well. So when we look at a patient with cancer in a COVID-19 era, so there are a lot of things that we have to look at. So the benefit, the risk of not giving treatment is that the cancer may progress or relapse. And if we do give the treatment, there is a worry that patient may get a COVID infection. So when we are each patient, we have to individualize and take a decision on what kind of treatment we have to give and how to treat the patient. So while cancer treatment itself is highly individualized, even in the past, today it has become even more important that for every patient we look at these things before we choose. So we look at the type of cancer that the patient has. The previous slide, sir. We look at the type of cancer they have, the stage of the cancer, then we look at the patient's general condition, their symptom burden. Then we look at also what is the chance that they will respond to a particular treatment, what are the side effects for the treatment, then discuss with the family the goals of therapy, what kind of support systems they have, and only then we can decide on what is the best treatment for the patient. So if I have a patient with a stage 4 cancer, where normally I might have treated them, I might today make a decision saying that the risk of an infection from repeated visits to the hospital itself is much more, and we might do only palliative care for that patient. So on a case to case basis, we make those decisions. Next slide, please. So it has to be highly individualized. And if a surgery is planned, currently the precautions that we are taking is because they have liberalized the way we can test for these patients. We are testing all patients with an RT-PCR, and all the patients are also getting a preoperative chest CT scan to see the CORADS score. We do discuss with the surgical oncologist if there is any possibility of avoiding surgery in the patient for the time being. So it might be like, for example, a patient with a prostate cancer, which is a low Gleason score, where normally we might have said go for surgery or for radiation. In this case, we might just say let's observe for 2 or 3 months what happens to the PSA level, or let's give hormonal therapy. Even in breast cancer, instead of chemotherapy, we might choose another therapy. There are many patients who have stage 4 cancers, and where we are individualizing treatment. I have one patient with cancer cervix where we gave 6 cycles of chemotherapy and targeted therapy. Response was very good. Normally, we would have continued the treatment, but in her case, because she's around 70 plus and has to come from Suryapet every 3 weeks, we decided so that the patient will not be at high risk from the travel that she choosing to stop.
Dr. Keshav, just kindly mute. Dr. Keshav. Carry on, madam.
So when we do radiation also, the type of radiation we are doing, in some cases, we are decreasing the number of radiation doses that we are giving to the patients. And we are also doing single fraction radiation, which has been proven in the past also to be effective for pain relief. So that is something that we can think about. But there are some places where we have to give radiation if it's an emergency, especially patients with spinal cord compression, brain metastasis. We have to continue to give the treatment. Next slide. So this is a patient of mine from Raipur. The first photograph is the breast tumor, which was there in March of this year. She had received 4 cycles of chemotherapy, but unfortunately did not respond very well. After the 4th cycle, that was the condition. So we were contemplating doing surgery or not for her, but considering that it would be difficult for her to come, and it does require some skill to do a toilet mastectomy, which is what would be needed in her case. We decided to, after discussion with our surgeon here, we decided to start her on hormonal therapy. And as you can see in the other photograph, which is after 4 months, the tumor has responded very well and has decreased in size. So we are planning to continue the hormonal therapy for another 2 months before we take for her surgery. So there are some places where we can wait, some places where we cannot wait, and I think that we should know. More importantly is what can't wait in patients who are with an advanced stage, where we can't say that you have a lot of disease and let's see. So one is patients with spinal cord compression, where they might develop paraparesis, bladder, bowel symptoms, where we have to immediately start treatment. Patients with brain metastasis, especially symptomatic brain metastasis, patients with pathologic fractures, intestinal obstruction, urinary retention, severe shortness of breath. These are patients where we might opt for treatment rather than palliation only with best supportive care, because treatment might improve their symptoms much more. Patients with severe anemia, thrombocytopenia, we will be asking them to come in to get their blood transfusions done. So TENS ascites, we have had multiple patients come where we have had to remove fluid, and any patient with pain always remains an emergency in cancer care, and they have to come to the hospital for treatment. Next. So what has changed definitely in the last 3 months is the use of telecommunication, which I think is happening in all fields, including oncology. So many places where we were doing, where patients would come to see us, we are now opting to do it on phone with video counseling or WhatsApp calls. So a lot of the times we had what was called a day 10 CBP, where after we gave the chemotherapy or in the middle of the cycle, they would come and show us their blood reports. Now all that is done by phone, and most of the symptom control also we are trying to do it on phone itself by doing video consultations and assessing the patient. We are also doing consultations with the local physicians more nowadays, where we are asking patients, once we have treated them, if they develop any complication, then we ask them to see a local physician and talk to the physician there and say, can you give some IV fluids, can you give this nausea medication. Patients with febrile neutropenia, for most part, we would admit them for injections. Now, for low risk febrile neutropenia, we are trying to shift to oral antibiotics. And reassessment scans too, which are important in stage 4. Are most of the guidelines say that scan them every 3 months, every 4 months. Now we are waiting, and if the patient becomes symptomatic or if we think the disease is progressing, then we will scan. If not, we are trying to increase the duration of scans. Excuse me. So far what I have discussed is the higher risk for patients with cancer and how we have to individualize their treatment based on their general condition, the stage of the cancer, and what our goal of therapy is for that particular patient. Now coming to recognizing corona in COVID-19 in patients with cancer. So the common symptoms, as you know, for COVID-19 patients are fever, cough, shortness of breath, sore throat, anosmia, taste changes, muscle pain, tiredness, nausea, and vomiting. For a lot of patients with cancer who are receiving chemotherapy, these symptoms can be from the treatment also. So it is not unusual for a patient with chemotherapy to have a cough or taste changes or diarrhea and nausea and vomiting. So what we call atypical presentations of corona. So how can we, there might be many cases where we don't know, am I dealing with a COVID-19 infection or am I just dealing with the side effects of chemotherapy? So how are we doing that nowadays? Again, pay a lot of attention to your patient and have a high index of suspicion for COVID. So we have had patients who have come with diarrhea and nausea and they have ended up with a positive test. We have had patients with taste changes where we thought it's from the chemotherapy and they've ended up with a positive test. So maintaining a high index of suspicion is very important. And I think when in doubt, we have to go ahead and test these patients. Next slide, sir. So the evaluation, so right now we have a different pathway. So patients will not be coming to the daycare center if we are suspecting a COVID infection. They will be in the separate area. So in care hospitals, in the specific ER where they will be initially evaluated, the possibility of corona should be entertained, and then we will decide on testing the patient. Admission is not mandatory even if you have a diagnosis of cancer and you are stable. So if you're a stable patient, there is no hypoxia, then again, this has to be highly individualized, but there are a fair number of patients whom we have treated at home for positive patients. The tests are the same that we do for any COVID patients, the RT-PCR test, the inflammatory markers with IL-6, ferritin, CRP, monitoring them periodically to see how they're improving, the CORADs. So everything else is the same. Now coming to this group of patients who are on surveillance. So there are many patients who have finished their cancer treatment, and this would also form a big part of our outpatients where they would come every 3 months for follow-up, and we would examine the patient, talk to them to see if they're at risk for recurrence. So now that has completely changed and we hardly see patients on surveillance coming to our OP. So what we are doing at care is we are calling our patients and doing a telecommunication. So every 3 months we are calling the patients. It's a video counseling call. What is the goal of surveillance? One is to evaluate for late side effects of chemotherapy, and other is to see is there any risk of recurrence. So even if we detect an recurrence early, does that translate into improved survival is what we have to know for that patient, and then decide on whether they have to come into the hospital for surveillance or not. But for most patients, we will not be doing a face-to-face follow-up, but a lot of it is right now telecommunication itself. Are there any special precautions that a cancer patient or caregiver has to take? And nothing other than what a normal patient, normal person has to take. But they have to be very strict about taking these precautions and cannot take it lightly that they will not get an infection. So a lot of times we see patients going around without masks, people going for, nowadays they're going to cafes, they're having dinners outside. So for cancer patients and their families, I think they still have to be very careful because we are not out of the woods yet. So avoiding crowded places, frequent hand washing, wearing a mask, social distancing, all this needs to be done. Next slide, please. So one of the questions sir had asked me was, are there any accessibility issues to cancer care, and what are the challenges that we are facing? And I think if we look from April to now, definitely the accessibility has eased a little bit. But in the first 2 months, April and May, we really had a lot of trouble delivering care to patients. And one example is children with cancer who were on maintenance treatments with 6-MP and methotrexate tablets, and they were in all the districts and they could not come to Hyderabad to collect their medications. So after the first 2 weeks of lockdown, what we did was that we mailed by post, we sent to about almost 200 children their maintenance tablets, 3 months duration of tablets, and then managed all their blood counts by phone. So that was one big challenge of delivering even tablets to the patients. So accessibility was definitely an issue that is easing a little bit now. More important, I think, is that patients are too scared to come to the hospital. So even if they have a breast lump for 3-4 months, they don't want to come. They're having bleeding PR, they don't want to come because they're worried that they will get corona. So while there is a risk of corona, it might be that the risk from cancer and not detecting it will be much more higher. So I'm urging everybody that if there is a symptom which is not going away, even though we are living in COVID times, you should go to the hospital and seek care. And hospitals are taking the necessary precautions to make sure that patients don't get the infection, at least from the healthcare workers. So the role of tumor boards and cancer boards becomes very important in these situations, because we are trying to see what is the best way to deliver care and minimize infection of COVID. So the tumor board is where all the specialists we sit and discuss the case. For example, the breast case that was there. Normally, the patient might have needed a surgery, but we discussed together between the medical oncologist and the surgeon in our team, the radiation oncologist, and decided that for this patient, hormonal therapy would be a better, safer option, and it worked out. So every patient right now we are discussing in our boards so that we can give them the best kind of care. Do we do blood transfusion? Can we get COVID-19 from blood transfusion? And so far there has been no documentation of that. There are no reports of transmission through transfusion. The other question is, can we donate blood? Because for our leukemia patients, we are really having trouble getting donors and delivering blood products to patients, platelets or PRBCs. So I think definitely we should be careful when we are going to the hospital to donate blood. If you are a patient who has been diagnosed with COVID-19 and has recovered, the current Indian guidelines are to wait for 28 days before donating the blood. How do we communicate with cancer patients was one question that sir had asked when you find them at home. And I think that declaring death at home is always a challenge for anybody. In fact, declaring death anywhere is a challenge to communicate to the family. For EMTs, it becomes even more difficult because they do not have that relationship with the family and the patient or the caregivers. So to give them this bad news is never easy. But what we have been taught during our training, which we follow even now, which would be useful even to EMTs, would be that to bring all the family members together, be calm when you are giving the news, tell them who you are, give a name and what you are, and what happened after you have reached the site, that you found the patient in a particular situation. This is the intervention that you did, you tried your best, and it did not help. And we have been told repeatedly to use the word death and not to say that the patient has gone to heaven, patient is in a better place now, he has left this world. Rather than that, we should use the word the patient has died from, so that information sinks into the family and they're able to absorb it. We also, once we deliver the bad news, have to give them the time and space that they need, and give the time they need to answer questions and to resolve doubts. So these are the things that we have to do for all patients, not just cancer patients, when we are declaring death. So sir, I think I will stop here. That is the COVID-19 part of the presentation,
Okay.
and I've already eaten 40 minutes of the time. So if there is any other questions, we can take it later.
Yeah, one question I want to ask before we go to the next speaker. It is a known case, one of our my known friend, colleague. He had a gastric ulcer and a cancer. He undergone gastrectomy. Now, he is completely all right. But very recently, he has been detected as COVID positive. So do you recommend anything specific for him? Any specific precautions he has to be taken? Because gastrectomy means, again, I don't know how you label it under high risk. It comes under high risk, or because B12 deficiency and all those things will be there. The only thing, he was having a good diet, but only thing is he is taking B12 injection very regularly every 3 months.
Okay.
So
So these patients might not be at much higher risk. It depends on whether he received any chemotherapy and radiation for the gastric cancer and how far away from the diagnosis he is. If it's been 6 months to a year from the diagnosis, I don't think that my treatment would be any different for him compared to any other person who comes with a positive test.
okay. Thank you, madam. Thanks. Many of them may be having more of questions, but we'll take it at the end of the session. Now I request next speaker, Dr. Vibha. Dr. Vibha, I'm sorry, I will not be able to introduce you in the way you are. She's a senior anesthetist, onco-anesthetist at Taraka Indo-American Cancer Center. And presently, she is working a lot in the COVID era. And as an anesthetist, she's taking care of the ICU, and she's also doing airway management and all. So I requested her to present the airway emergencies, whether it in the pre-hospital care and at the hospital care. I think she prepared some slides. And, I want to go from the beginning. Are you able to see your slides, Dr. Vibha?
Sir, I wanted you to enable my screen sharing. It says you have disabled my screen
No,
sharing.
but I'm very sorry. I'm very poor in this. I'm trying to do that.
Okay.
I'm doing
Okay.
it's getting jammed.
Okay. Can you give me the remote control, because the slides are not in
Okay.
full slide mode. So
now,
I think I would just.
Now I approved it. It has come. Vibha Nayak wants to share the screen. I have approved. Now I think you will be able to.
Okay. So I'll just try and see if I can get through this.
Dr. Vibha is a medical student from Pune. And she did her post-graduation also from Pune. And she worked in many of the hospitals, Vellore Medical College and all. But most of the time she has spent in Hyderabad, being her husband is also a ophthalmic oncosurgeon at LV Prasad Eye Institute. Thank you, Dr. Vibha, to be a part of this. And I'm happy that you are able to share the screen. You wanted to share I think you can change the slide yourself. Thank you, Vibha.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, sir.
One thing I've seen from Pune, the what you call it, scrolling, that 52% of the people are having antibodies. That means they've already come to herd immunity. Am I correct? Did I understand that way, or anything else they want to say?
Yes, Maharashtra, there has been a lot of community spread, and Pune, even Mumbai, they have found very high levels of antibody titers, higher, particularly in slum areas, people residing there, and lesser in the other areas. And I recently tested myself, and unfortunately I was negative. So let me just put this to completion. So I think it does require you to get infected, at least moderate symptoms, for you to develop antibodies. With mild symptoms, there could be few people who get antibodies, but not all of them. So, right, I think I'll move on to the topic. And at the outset, I want to thank Rajnath Singh sir for inviting me for this forum. And he wants me to cover airway emergencies, particularly the airway obstruction. So, according to me, the airway emergencies, airway obstructions are probably the most challenging to be managed during COVID era. And this is because as much as you're trying to optimize giving the best care to your patient, what is at stake is your safety. And there's a very, very thin line that you're going to tread on. And this is basically because we know that COVID-19 can spread not just via droplets, but also via aerosols. And aerosols basically are particles which are smaller than 5 microns, and they can travel more than 6 feet in distance. I think I just lost control.
The thing, normally it happens when.
Okay, can you just move the next slide for me, sir?
No, I am also not able to move it. Oh, yeah.
Okay, there we are.
Yeah.
So why are really we worried about the airway emergencies? Because when you are managing a patient with an airway emergency, most likely it's going to be an aerosol generating procedure. The patient who's breathless may be coughing. Your treatment, which could include the nebulizations, the different modes of oxygen supplementation, and other modalities of management like bag and mask ventilation, CPR, suctioning, NIV, intubation, all of these are going to be aerosol generating procedures. So you have to be very, very careful while you do them. Next slide, please.
Not able to move, Dr. Rupa.
Oh, okay, then maybe you can just, I'll stop the remote
So
control
screen-
and we can just go on to you moving the slide. Is it possible right now?
I'm also not able to move. That's what. Just a minute. Now I can go. Is this the one you wanted?
Yeah, the one before that. Yeah, can I get it on the full screen? Or does it hang that way?
No, I don't want to go. Again, if I go to full screen again, when I change the slide, it is not going.
Okay, right. So we'll move on to the next slide.
Want me to try full screen?
Can I have the next slide? Yeah, yeah. Okay, full screen.
This is the one you wanted full screen, is it?
Yeah, yeah. So all of these procedures are going to be aerosol generating, and hence, next slide. The essential rule is to consider all patients, if not confirmed, at least suspected COVID-19 positive, which means that you are going to protect yourself with complete PPE. Now, a complete PPE could mean, can I have the previous slide? The complete PPE could mean a coverall, or it could mean a fluid resistant gown with a plastic apron, full sleeves gown with shoe covers, preferably two double gloves on. But the most important part of this suit that is going to protect you from aerosols is the use of N95 mask. What we usually do is, over the N95 mask, we cover it with a surgical 2-ply mask and some form of eye protection. So it can be either a goggle or it can be a face shield. So all this is going to be important. Now moving on to what could be the causes of airway obstruction, which we know are many, and today we are just going to focus on the oncological causes, that is the airway tumors. In airway tumors, tumors either in nasopharynx, oral cavity, oropharynx, larynx or hypopharynx, all of these can give symptoms of airway obstruction. Next slide. Yeah. Can I, next slide? I'm just missing one photograph here, sir. No. Next. Next. Next slide. Yeah, right. Thank you. Back. Yeah, thank you. So here I have a few cases to discuss with you who could land in airway obstruction. So if we look at the first case on the corner, it is a buccal mucosa cancer with an exophytic growth. Now, typically, this patient should not have significant signs of airway obstruction because most of the tumor is not going to occupy the entire airway. So if this patient is going to be breathless, is going to be desaturating, you have to think of other possible causes. If we look at the second picture, which is a tongue cancer, you see there is a big mass sitting on the tongue, probably also extending to the posterior 1/3 of the tongue, and she is somebody who can develop airway obstruction, is a high risk for airway obstruction. The third picture, if we see, there is a pyriform fossa mass around the epiglottis or any other similar malignancy, say post-cricoid malignancy. These type of malignancies can obstruct the airway and cause symptoms of breathlessness and dyspnea. And if we look at the last picture, it is basically a thyroid cancer, a large hard mass which has infiltrated into the trachea. And if you look on the sternum, there's a swelling there also, and this patient has sternal metastasis. So this patient, though overtly from outside, does not look very gross, is going to have symptoms of airway obstruction, and managing this case is going to be much, much more difficult. And I'm going to talk about it in the next slides. Next slide. Okay, one more next slide. The next slide, please.
The one?
Okay. So other things are the, yes, yes. The other things are the previous treatment, cancer treatment that the patient has received. So if you look at the left, the picture on the leftmost side, this is a patient who's received radiation in the neck, and you see that there is, the neck is swollen in texture. This is because of the neck fibrosis. And the same patient inside is what you see. There was a small video running, and you see that after radiation, he's developed laryngeal edema. Laryngeal edema, the laryngeal opening is narrowed, and the patient is having breathing difficulty. So this could be one of the reasons. Other reasons because of previous cancer treatment could include the previous surgery. Because of the surgery, there are anatomical as well as physiological changes in the airway, because of which the muscle tone in the airway is reduced, and there can be airway obstruction. Next slide, please. Next slide. The previous slide.
The previous one. Before anything.
Okay. Yeah. That's it. Yeah. So if the patient has airway obstruction, how are we going to manage? I think the first step is to make sure that we give a surgical 2-ply mask to the patient. Most of the times, patients, they may carry their own masks, they may have a cloth mask. Remember that cloth mask may not be sufficient enough, because the aerosols can still get transmitted to you. So minimum that the patient needs to wear is a surgical 2-ply mask, whether the patient is an adult or a child, unless the child is less than 2 years or has significant dyspnea that the patient is just unable to keep the mask on the top, or if the patient is unconscious. And not just the patient, but you should encourage mask to be worn by everybody around. So if there is a patient attendant who's going to be there, who's going to give you history, it may be worthwhile to hand over the surgical 2-ply mask to the patient's attendant also. Previous slide. Yeah, as you go through a quick history taking, it is essential to assess the patient, check the vitals quickly. So depending on what kind of monitor you have, definitely the most important vital is the saturation. But apart from saturations, also are important is the heart rate and the blood pressure. In a patient who is hypoxic, you would expect some amount of tachycardia. And the most important thing is that in patients with chronic airway obstruction, the CO2 levels could be high. So there could be hypercarbia, and their blood pressure can be exceptionally high. It's like I've seen patients with blood pressure of 200 with airway obstructions, and the moment a tracheostomy was done for that patient, the BP has just crashed. So we have to remember that a high blood pressure can be because of hypercarbia, and we should not aim at treating the blood pressure at that time, but aim to treat the airway obstruction first, and then reassess the blood pressure, which can be treated if it is still staying high. Now, what next? If the saturations are low, you're going to start giving some oxygen. Nasal prongs can be used. Flows 2 to 6 liters per minute is what you already know. I feel that nasal prongs are more comfortable for the patient, and also that you can put a 3-ply mask over the patient, and that further reduces the risk of aerosol generation. But the limitation of nasal prong is that you will not be able to exceed the FiO2 of more than 0.4. So not more than 40% oxygen you will be able to deliver. So if the patient is still requiring higher oxygen concentrations, you would have to move to a face mask, preferably with a reservoir, so that you are able, though it claims that it can deliver up to 100% oxygen in clinical practice, it is often seen that up to 80% of oxygen concentration can be delivered. While you manage airway obstruction with oxygen, also what is important is the assessment of the airway. If there is wheezing, you will have to give the patient some form of bronchodilator, usually Astelin. Nebulizations are given. But again, during COVID times, because nebulizations can be aerosol generating, most of the guidelines have moved towards using inhalers. Though not all drugs are available as inhalers. Say if you want to nebulize adrenaline because you're suspecting some amount of laryngeal edema, we know that adrenaline is not available as an inhaler. And probably what can be done is what is shown in this picture here. Mr. Larry Merlick, he has made a nebulization device by attaching a T-piece to it and putting a filter at the end of the T-piece. So this way, you can better nebulize the patient safer, so that whatever is the exhaled breath is going to be filtered as it comes out. So if you are unable to use inhalers and you have to nebulize, probably this way is safer to nebulize. Or if the patient is having stridor, it is essential to give steroids. And if you've managed to secure an IV line, then probably given 8 milligrams of IV Dexa is the best way forward. Particularly in airway tumors, giving a shot of steroids definitely helps. It will, a single dose will not do as harm as good it might if it is the right drug at that time. So please go ahead to give a shot of steroid if you find a patient in stridor. If the airway is not patent, then you would have to proceed with bag mask ventilation, and either just a bag mask ventilation or proceeding with a definitive airway, which could be a supraglottic airway or an endotracheal intubation, depending on the expertise level. Whatever you do, whatever you use, make sure that you connect viral filters. So if you're using a bag mask, there has to be a viral filter there. And if you're putting a supraglottic airway or an endotracheal tube, please connect viral filters. If the tumor lies in the nasopharynx, in the oropharynx, or in the laryngopharynx, occupying a significant quantity of the airway space, then it will be very difficult for you to intubate or put a supraglottic airway. And the only life-saving procedure for these patients is going to be tracheostomy. But often tracheostomies are performed in the hospital settings by specialists. So as an emergency medicine person out on the field, something that you can do to rescue this patient is scalpel cricothyrotomy. And there are two figures here to quickly demonstrate how it is done. So the first step is to palpate with the finger on the neck the Adam's apple. Once you feel the Adam's apple, just slide your finger down to the first gap, that is the cricothyroid membrane. It is the membrane between the thyroid and the cricoid cartilage. In that gap, take a scalpel and put a deep nick so that the skin as well as the cricothyroid membrane is punctured. Beyond this, either you can use a bougie, or if bougie is not available, then you can use your little finger just to widen the gap and push the bougie inside the trachea, over which the endotracheal tube can be railroaded. Next slide. Okay, next slide again. I think I missed that photograph. Yeah, okay. Now, just to summarize the different types of airway tumors and what airway management is apt for these patients. So if we look at the first patient, we know that if this patient had stopped breathing because of any other reason, it is going to be difficult to mask ventilate because the tumor is sitting right there where you would be putting your mask. Probably if there's adequate space inside the mouth, you can go ahead and put a supraglottic airway and ventilate this patient. If we look at the second picture, where there is a large tongue tumor, it will be very difficult to put a supraglottic airway because the tumor may break while you put the laryngeal mask airway. Also, ventilating this patient could be difficult because all of the tumor is going to sit inside the mouth and you may not be able to ventilate. So for this patient, what needs to be done is front of neck access, which means either tracheostomy or a scalpel cricothyrotomy. Same is true with the third picture, where it is a pyriform fossa or a post-cricoid mass. you would need a front of neck access. But if we look at the last patient where there is a big thyroid sitting there and the tumor obstructing and infiltrating the trachea, you will doing a cricothyrotomy or a tracheostomy is impossible. But in these patients, sometimes intubation may not be very difficult. If the upper airway is clear and open, we are often able to see the cords. The only thing is when you're pushing the tube inside, you may fracture a part of the tumor which can get displaced inside the lung. But you would have saved the day by being able to ventilate this patient. So probably going ahead and intubating is still a choice for that patient. There is one more question that sir wanted me to address, and that was about managing dyspneic patients in COVID times. Sir, should I do it now or should I come back to it later?
No, you continue it. You do it now.
Okay, okay, right, sure, will. So can I have the next slide, please? As Sudha madam mentioned, that it is not very common to have patients who, while working in a cancer hospital, who become dyspneic, and these could be new admissions, or these also could be patients who are already there in the hospital, who are undergoing some form of treatment, either chemotherapy or radiation, or have undergone surgery a couple of days back. Whatever the criteria, whatever the type of the patient is, as per our hospital protocol, any patient who is dyspneic or has become acutely dyspneic needs to go to an isolation ward or a COVID ICU, designated ICU, depending on the severity of how breathless the patient is. This patient has to be moved outside the general area. I'll call it a general area where all the non-COVID cancer patients are taking treatment. So as early as possible, this patient has to be moved from a general area to a COVID area, either an isolation ward or an ICU. After the patient is moved there, the COVID area, all the staff are with complete PPE. So they would quickly go through the history, what treatment has the patient received, since when did the symptoms start, and check vitals as I already described before. Any patient whose saturations are much lower than what his clinical condition could show, you should have a very high risk suspicion for COVID. And this is because of what we already know is silent hypoxia, which can occur in COVID patients. Apart from starting, previous slide please, apart from starting oxygen for these patients, depending on whatever FiO2 may be desirable based on the symptoms, we definitely, for all patients who enter our isolation ward and COVID ICU, we send the nasopharyngeal swab, we do the CT chest, and we send a first set of COVID tests, like Sudha madam mentioned, the blood tests. Next slide. Yeah, now talking of the management of dyspneic patients, there is always the dilemma of whether this patient should receive high flow nasal oxygen or this patient should receive non-invasive ventilation. So high flow nasal oxygen, I'm just going to talk about it in the next slide, but it is basically the lady on the left, where you can see that small nasal prongs are there, but it is attached to a big device, which I'm going to explain a little later. And NIV is basically going to be a big NIV mask, which is gripped onto the patient's face. And we have devices which can provide both alternatives. So basically, high flow nasal oxygen device can come as a standalone device, or it can also be a part of a ventilator. So I'm going to talk about what we select, but first let us understand what each of them are. So high flow nasal oxygen, this is a standalone device that I've shown on the left side. It's a very, very simple device. It does not require a ventilator. A ventilator may have high flow as an added device, but it is not essential. So what are the components? There is a flow meter wherein you can adjust the oxygen flow. There's going to be a humidifier and the nasal prongs, which is the nasal interface. So the advantage of this device over a regular nasal prong is the high flow. So you are able to deliver 30 to 60, up to 60 liters per minute of flows, and How this is going to help is that the peak inspiratory flow rate of a patient, even if the patient is breathless, the deepest the patient can breathe is going to be 45 to 50 liters per minute, and this device can provide 60 liters per minute. So all the inspiration is going to be from this device, and this helps us to give a high FiO2 up to FiO2 of 1, which means 100% oxygen can be given through this device. This device also has an advantage that, similar to nasal prongs, it is very comfortable for the patient, and you are able to put a mask on a patient, like you can see on the down hand right side. There's a mask that can be put even when the patient is on high flow nasal oxygen. Now, talking about NIV, which is the non-invasive ventilation, this is basically the NIV mask. There have been newer devices that can be used with NIV, and one of that is NIV full face mask. And this has come mainly because the NIV mask can be very claustrophobic sometimes to the patient. It can cause a lot of skin injury in the area where the mask is going to fit tightly, and so the full face mask actually covers a broader area, so it's a little more comfortable for the patient. Also is available something that is called as the NIV hood or the NIV helmet, where the entire face is going to be in the NIV chamber, and this is yet more comfortable for the patient, but the price definitely increases as we move on from NIV mask to NIV full face mask to NIV hood or helmet. NIV hood or helmet is the most expensive. Can I have the previous slide? Okay, now where do we prefer NIV over high flow? So if is definitely the first choice that we use in oncological patients, and particularly if we are suspecting a COVID patient, high flow definitely helps, because the difference between the two is high flow is preferred whenever there is hypoxia with normocapnia, which means the main problem is that your oxygen levels are low and your CO2 levels could be low or normal. Whereas NIV is preferred whenever there is hypercapnia, which means your CO2 levels are high along with low oxygen saturations. And this is usually found if the patient has COPD, if the patient is asthmatic. So these situations you would find more of hypercapnia. Yeah, next slide. If we'll go to the previous slide, sir. So if the non-invasive methods like high flow and non-invasive ventilation does not work, if the patient is crashing right in front of you, if the airway is not patent, or if the patient is arresting, definitely we need to go ahead and put in a definitive airway, which is the endotracheal intubation. Probably supraglottic airway may not be very helpful in the ICU, because doctors who are skilled enough to intubate are already there, and they would prefer doing a definitive endotracheal intubation. Whenever you're doing an endotracheal intubation, rapid sequence is preferred, which means that it is better that you do not ventilate the patient, but the patient just stops breathing with a muscle relaxant quickly, and within 1 minute you are able to intubate this patient. If you are having to ventilate this patient because the saturations are very low and there is no other choice but to give some amount of ventilation to get some oxygen through, then using a plastic sheet through which you have connected the circuit over can be helpful. Or we have used intubation boxes in our operation theaters. Though the intubation box can be a little cumbersome to use, plastic sheets are very, very simple and effective to use, and that can be used even in an emergency setting, say even outside hospital settings.
Dr. Vibha,
Yeah.
Vibha, I just want to ask you here, at what stage you want to move from NIV to definitive airway, rapid sequence intubation?
Okay. Okay. Yeah. I'm not sure whether I had put that slide, but it is basically a respiratory rate oxygen index is what is calculated. So initially you would connect say you've connected a high flow oxygen, and after connecting high flow oxygen, you're going to monitor the oxygen saturations. If your oxygen saturations have picked up, if your oxygen saturations are in late 80s, I think it is still fine to continue on for a couple of hours more and get an ABG done to see what the PaO2 and PaCO2 levels are. If the so this is a
Hello?
calculation. Yeah.
There is no
Yes.
A. Yeah. You want
Yes,
to
Sudha
ask,
ma'am wants to say something.
madam, you want to say
Okay.
something, Sudha madam?
No, I think we lost her. So basically there is an index which is calculated based on the saturation, the amount of FiO2 that you are generating, that is going to the patient, and the respiratory rate of the patient. So there is an index which is calculated, and based on this index, you will decide whether you're going to intubate this patient or not. But clinically, yes, if you think that non-invasive ventilation, high flow oxygen, it is not helping the patient, if the patient is still crashing either hemodynamically or the saturations are still sitting at a very low. Did I answer your question, sir, or did you want to?
Yeah, yeah, thank you. This is
Yeah.
just thing for
So when,
EMTs who work in the ambulance
yeah,
should know, because they don't have the ABG and all. So clinically, what are
yeah,
the parameters they have to see? That's the reason I wanted to. If
yeah.
I
So it's going to be the saturation and the respiratory rate against the FiO2. So if you are still at an FiO2 of 0.4, you have a margin of increasing your FiO2. But at 100% FiO2, if your saturation is still staying below 85, and if your respiratory rate is 40 and above, you would have to go ahead and intubate this patient.
Thank you, Dr.
Yeah. When we talk about endotracheal intubation, these are certain guidelines and precautions that we follow. We prefer doing a video laryngoscopy. I know it may not be available out on the field, but I just want to say that how this is helpful is that normally when you intubate, you end up going very close to the patient, trying to peep inside the patient's mouth. So video laryngoscopy actually helps you maintain the distance. You can see it on the screen, and this is how it reduces the aerosols coming on your face. Another very, very important point is to inflate the cuff immediately after the patient is intubated, and we have the habit of checking the cuff pressure. Cuff pressure monitor is not a very expensive device, so I don't know if it could be made available on the ambulances, but checking it is important because keeping it low can actually cause leak. Sorry. And leaking endotracheal tube increases the risk of aerosol formation. And if you keep it very high, then there is a chance of necrosis of the tracheal mucosa, and patient can land up into post-intubation stenosis, which can be a long-term complication. Another point to understand that suctioning is also an aerosol generating procedure, and hence we try and do it under a plastic sheet to reduce the aerosol, or if the patient is already in the ICU, then we use the closed suction catheters. Next slide, please. Next slide. Oh.
Is the one?
Okay. Yeah. So there is lots to talk about regarding the COVID management protocol and the other drugs in terms of medication and prone positioning, which I don't think I want to cover now. Next slide, please. Next slide, please.
Should I move?
Yeah, please. Yeah, but three important things that I want to say. Can we just go to the previous slide? Three important things that I want to say whenever you are managing a patient whose dyspneic has airway obstruction is first is be wary of the biomedical waste. So the way you dispose of the things that you use, if you've used a supraglottic airway, where and how you're going to put it, if you've used bag mask ventilation to ventilate this patient, where and how you're going to keep it, and how you're going to sanitize it for the next patient use. Emphasis on hand washing, hand hygiene the talk cannot be complete without emphasizing on this, as well as telling the importance of the correct way of donning and doffing your PPE. And the last slide, right. One thing that I want to emphasize here is that it does not matter how many resources you have. You may be working in the field with very minimal resources, but whatever you have, you need to know how to make the best use of them. And I have just shown a picture of one of my colleagues who's sealing her N95 mask with a tape. So you may be using an N95 mask, but if you have not sealed it adequately, it is not going to give you adequate protection. Thank you so much. Stay safe, stay healthy during this COVID era.
Thank you,
Thank you,
Dr.
sir.
Vibha. Before I move on to Dr. Prardhana, I just wanted to ask you, this is for the interest of our healthcare providers and EMTs who work in the ambulance. What is the role of EMT in managing pain in cancer patient en route to hospital? What is the best analgesic you prefer to them?
So right from emergency department is what I can tell, that we can use fentanyl. I don't know whether fentanyl is available for them. If it is, fentanyl can be used in small aliquots. So you can start with 0.5 to 1 microgram per kg. There is a little worry regarding using opioids, and the worry is that this can cause respiratory depression. It can lower the consciousness of the patient, and this is a valid worry, but you can selectively kind of select your patient where you would want to give opioids. And also I think practicing using it gives you a little more confidence in using it. So these are the two things that I would want to say, that yes, opioid can be used, but use it in the right patient, use it in the right dose, and use it so that it will give you more confidence to use it the next time.
Thank you, Dr. Vibha. Still, there are some questions. If we have time after the Dr. Prardhana's presentation, we'll get back to you and Dr. Sudha. Dr. Prardhana, sure. She's my colleague at LV Prasad Eye Institute. She also works at Asian Institute of Gastroenterology. So my first question to Dr. Prardhana is, in your routine anesthesia practice, what are the oncology cases you are taking care in LV Prasad and Asian Institute of Gastroenterology? Dr. Prardhana.
Yeah. Good evening, everyone. Sorry, I don't have any slides, but I can answer the questions. So coming to the first question, I work, like how sir has introduced, I work both in LV Prasad and AIG hospitals. In LV Prasad, it's an ophthalmic eye hospital, and we cater to all the ophthalmic eye tumors. So it can be any part of the eye. It can be the eyelid, it can be the cornea, conjunctiva, all the layers of the eyes. But the most common tumor which we deal with is retinoblastoma. And anesthesia, as part of anesthesia, most of the children, the pediatric population who have tumors are under anesthesia care. Rest of the adult patients, they can be taken up under local anesthesia, which might not be our part of discussion, but especially we usually anesthetize patients who are under 5 years of age. And coming to retinoblastoma, most of our patients are usually we have around 100 cases per month. It was pre-COVID era. Before COVID, we used to have 100 cases per month just for examination under anesthesia. And then the total number of surgeries we used to do maybe from 20 to 30 under GA, only pediatric patients. This is what I'm talking about. After COVID, yes. Now these numbers are affected after COVID because the patient had to come so far, and they had to undergo the COVID screening and all, and they had to travel from different parts of India and come down here. So now the previous guidelines were like they used to check the patient every 3 weeks. Every 3 weeks for progression of the tumor. So every 3 weeks, the patient used to be under anesthesia, and they used to just check the eye using the fundus or the retinoscope, and what all investigations they have, they check it. But now, because of this COVID era, they have reduced those examination under anesthesia to spacing them between 2 months, every 2 months or 3 months, like that. Then another part is where we give a full GA for these patients. That is where they have the tumor invading and they have to remove the eyeball. So it can be enucleation or evisceration. These are the procedures and these are the tumors which we deal in LV Prasad Eye Institute. And coming to AIG, I work in the endoscopy suite. And in endoscopy suite, we usually do palliative procedures for the cancer patients. And we cater to periampullary carcinomas, any carcinoma from the mouth till the anus, in the colon or in the esophagus, in the duodenum, in the pancreas. So different kinds of tumor patients come down. But the most common problems this periampullary carcinoma patient face is obstructive jaundice. So the main procedure what we do is ERCP, and they put a stent into the common bile duct. For that we have to give sedation. So once that stent is in place, the bilirubin levels will come down and the patient can undergo chemotherapy, or probably a palliative procedure is done for them.
Dr. Prardhana,
Yes.
in AIG, you are still using sedation. You are not intubating or putting any airway devices, just a sedation, huh?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
For the procedures where there is only a simple stent is required, or when they just do an endoscopy or colonoscopy, these procedures we can just simply do on the sedation, provided now we take all the precautions, like how Dr. Vibha Nayak has explained in her slides. We either use a box or a plastic sheet to cover the patients while intubation. In the same way, now when they're using an endoscope or a colonoscope, that's a tube which is going into the airway. So there is a lot of aerosol production chances are there. So they definitely take precautions by covering the patient with a cover, and then all of them donning the PPE as described by Dr. Vibha. And we give only sedation. The patient position can be lateral or prone position. And the duration of procedure will be based on the experience of the person doing. Sometimes it is done in just 15 minutes. Sometimes it takes 45 minutes based on what kind of procedure they're doing.
Dr. Prardhana, the other thing what I wanted to ask you about are you preferring supraglottic airway devices like LMA and or definitive airway for retinoblastoma cases? Because
yes, sir. So coming to retinoblastoma cases, which are the huge numbers which we take care, most of the procedures are short duration procedures. They are just examination. They either do laser or they do TTT, that is transpapillary thermotherapy, or they may do brachytherapy. These all procedures will not go beyond 10 to 15 minutes of duration. Now, for a 10 to 15 minutes procedure, if I keep on giving a general anesthesia, the risk of aerosol and the risk of repeated anesthesia for the patients is high. So we rather go on supraglottic airways. Now, in supraglottic airways, we have option of first generation and second generation. The first generation supraglottic airways are the normal classic LMAs. Most of you in UMRI are familiar with it. The second generation one is the Procel LMA or the iGel, which has an aspiration port in it. Now, the choice depends on the anesthetist, but in my preference, I choose the classic LMA because, like I said, the duration of procedures will decide what I'm doing. And probably if it's a 10-minute procedure, there is not an advantage for iGel, because iGel will take some time to get a proper seal. So it will take to attain a proper seal. For that, it is like it has to attain the temperature, the body temperature, for it to take the anatomical shape and give a proper seal. But during that time, the procedure is over and I can remove the iGel or LMA, whatever I'm facing. So instead of going for an IGL, I can put a classic LMA, provided I take precautions. Now, what precautions do we require? One thing is we have to not give very high flows. Sometimes people intend to go for 8 to 10 liters of flow, but no, we are dealing, if we can go till 4 liters of flow is sufficient to place the LMA. And then when you are inflating the cuff should be inflated before connecting to the circuit. And like already emphasized by Dr. Vibha, that we have to put a viral filter to any of the airway devices what we are using. And then the short duration procedure, we can leave the patient on spontaneous ventilation. When he is on spontaneous ventilation, it is a negative pressure ventilation. Therefore, the production of aerosol, even if there is a mild leak, will not be much.
Okay. So the other one I wanted to ask you is, in our pre-hospital care, what this is question for you and Dr. Vibha. What supra-airway, glottic airway device you advise in the ambulance, the first generation or the second generation? Dr. Vibha, except
Yeah.
that IGEL is not that convenient.
Yes.
As she's telling, the temperature
Yes.
is necessary to enclose the area, and it will take a longer time. You accept that?
Yes, yes, yes. That is one of the limitation. As she said, in shorter duration procedures, it definitely will not be useful. Classic LMA, yes, can be used, but I feel that ProSeal LMA also, if it is available, can be helpful. The reason being that it has a gastric tube through which you can put in a Ryle's tube. So if it is somebody who is prone for vomiting, aspiration, the ProSeal will end up protecting the airway as well as give a conduit for emptying the gastric secretions. So any one of the two should be fine, I feel.
So you say that put an LMA, put it in prone position, put the patient in prone position?
It can be used. So again, because ProSeal, the tubing is a little flexible as compared to classic LMA. Okay. With LMA, lateral position and prone positions we have used for general anesthesia, and it does not usually get displaced because it is not a very stiff structure.
Thank you, Dr. Prardhana. I just wanted to ask you about some of the awareness programs what LV Prasad Eye Institute does for stoma. Every year, we are aware that the oculoplasty people, they do some awareness program. Can you just enlighten the audience here about that?
Yes, yes, sir. Yeah, before that, I would like to add one more thing, that if we are going for a pre-hospital stabilization of the patient and trying to put an LMA or a splenotic airway, and that is going to be prolonged, like how Dr. Vibha has suggested ProSeal LMA, even IGEL also can be used in that situation where we don't know how long the patient a definitive airway is in place with any generation of supraglottic airways. But when you put them in prone position, I think the preform shaped supraglottic airways, that is either PASCA or IGEL or Supreme LMA, will be more useful rather than using a classic one which is flexible and the ProSeal which is flexible. And is that fine, sir?
Yeah, thank you. How about that retinoblastoma awareness programs? You want to tell something?
So in LV Prasad, as the number of retinoblastoma patients each year keep on increasing, and most of them, they come from very low socioeconomic status. They have done many awareness programs, and I think the past 2 years they have conducted 2 marathons. It is called With the Lawn, and these 2 marathons, one was in 2016 17, other one is 2018, other one is 2019, and near the Necklace Road, usually May, in the month of May. And each year around 2,500 runners participated, 2,500 to 3,000 runners, and whatever funds were raised from this marathon, it was used for the treatment of these patients. Like whatever treatment, there may be eye prosthesis or the laser or the chemotherapy or the radiation, whatever it is, it was incurred in these things. Even I think in 2020 also it was planned, but because of the COVID and all, it couldn't be done. But every year the participation has been increasing.
Thank you. Thank you, Pradhana. Now I ask our other participants who are there, Dr. Ramnarao and other, Dr. Raveen and all, if they have any questions to be asked to this
I
expert.
have one question for the panel here, particularly Dr. Sudha Garu, because we work in very challenging terrains, and sometimes by the time we reach, there may not be any signs of life. So in such situations, as an oncologist, can you just tell our EMS professionals that what is the role of the, I would say, the communication? I'm particularly using announcing the death or suspecting the death or a grief counseling, what you refer. Your expert comments on that, Dr. Sudha.
Yeah, sir. So I had alluded to it a little bit during my talk. So basically, if to declare a patient dead, it's difficult in any situation, especially for the EMT physician, because they do not have a relationship, an existing relationship with the patient and the family. So I think a good communication is vital. So most of the oncology patients generally have an idea that the family has an idea that the patient is not doing well, and the death is an expected death for most patients. So in such situations, I think just gathering the family and explaining to them that the patient is dead and using the word death is very important so that it sinks in. So in our training also, we were told not to use, any kind of euphemism saying that the patient swargavasi ho gaye or something like that, but rather than to say that the patient is dead. So that has to be conveyed to the family very clearly. That is one thing. Second is whatever are the efforts that the EMT person has made, that also has to be explained, because many times families feel that maybe they didn't do enough for their loved one. So explaining that this is the situation in which we came and this is what we found and we couldn't do more than what we did, and that it was not a lot of suffering for the patient is something that they have to explain to the family, and then give them time to understand the situation for that information to sink in, and also ask the family if they have any questions or doubts. And after that, they can leave. I think these are the steps. They have to gather the family members, explain what they did after coming and seeing the patient, and that the patient is dead, and asking them if they have any doubts or any clarifications that they need.
Dr. Sudha madam, just I wanted for my, this thing I'm asking, what difference it will make if they say the patient is dead or swargavasi, anything that will affect
So
the...
sometimes patients don't understand. So sometimes, we say patient nahi rahe, and that they might not understand that, or patient is no more. When we say that, it might not, that information might not sink in. So they keep asking, what do you mean by that? So when we use the word death, it is a way of conveying to them the finality of the situation.
Madam, when you were in MNJ, you used to do a lot of work with the NGOs. Are you still continuing that work?
Yes, sir. Very actively involved with the organizations that work in MNJ. One is the foundation called Impact, where we help children to complete their treatment. And what I was telling before, how we had to send medications to all the children. So we had to make a list of all the children with leukemia who were getting treatment and make sure that they received their maintenance therapies. Children with solid tumors, making sure during this time that there was no gap in their treatment. For example, Hodgkin lymphoma, every 2 weeks on time you have to give, or else we are compromising on cure rate. But during the lockdown time, they were not able to come. So we had our counselors call the families and then hand over the patients to the local doctors, find oncologists who would treat them during that time. That was one thing we did with Impact. So a lot of things we have done in this time. The other organization, Pain Relief and Palliative Care Society, also we are still very actively involved, where we are delivering end-of-life care to patients and home care. So very challenging situations for us during this time, but we are still trying to see that we can give them optimal care.
Thank you. Dr. Vibha, because we have a lot of pre-hospital care people out there who are also watching in the YouTube stream, I wanted to ask you about the intraosseous. Suppose in this COVID era, do you also practice intraosseous? I see you training a lot of people, because our people, they take ITLS, which is one of the workstation is intraosseous. Do you advise them to go for intraosseous if there is no, if they cannot get IV cannulation, because it's an aerosol generating procedure, what drilling the bone and all? What is your advice for that intraosseous?
See, I think intraosseous is a life-saving procedure. You're going to think of intraosseous only if you think that you're unable to secure vein. And even when CPR can be done with certain precautions, intraosseous definitely should be done. Okay, so you need to protect yourself from aerosol generating procedures like wearing an N95 mask and wearing a coverall, having a face shield or a goggle, and probably going ahead and performing intraosseous if you are skilled enough to have it and if you have the equipment to do it, because yes, it can save one life.
One more question which I missed, and any of the panelists can answer this, about the use of antibiotics in our pre-hospital, because I still remember Dr. Sudha Madam, when she visited our institute to deliver a lecture, she recommended to use antibiotics very as much as possible, because it will definitely reduce the mortality rate and morbidity rate of the patient. What do you advise, Vibha or Sudha or Pratha? Do you recommend antibiotic in the pre-hospital care for the cancer patient?
Yeah, so I will tell from an oncologist point of view. I think for us, febrile neutropenia is the emergency, where if we suspect that the patient will have a low blood count, we want to give the antibiotic right away. So, but indiscriminate use of antibiotics should also not be there. I would say that if it is a patient who is on active chemotherapy, and if you're seeing the patient where the patient looks septic or has a severe shortness of breath, fevers, it is definitely worthwhile giving the antibiotics. If it's a patient with a history of cancer, but they're not getting any treatment in the last 1 month, where they've not received active chemotherapy and are not at a risk of low counts, then we can avoid the antibiotic and have the patient come to the hospital. So as an EMT, I think we need to know whether the patient has received chemotherapy or not. And if they have received chemotherapy in the recent 3 weeks, I would err on the side of giving antibiotics.
In line with what Sudha Madam just mentioned, I think one more point, whatever she mentioned is absolutely right. Just one more small point I wanted to make is the hemodynamic stability. So if the issue is probably only related to the respiratory part of it, it can still wait. But if the patient's blood pressure is staying low, like she mentioned, that if you're suspecting sepsis, then antibiotic needs to be given. But if it is only desaturation, which can occur because of any other upper airway related emergencies also, probably giving an antibiotic is not essential. It can be thought over judiciously.
What is the role of analgesics? You have already asked Vibha. Fentanyl is told, but fentanyl we can't use it in the ambulance because it comes under Drug Control Act, so it will not be useful. What is the other to control the pain? Paracetamol, will it be of a good use?
Paracetamol in a good dose, like giving 1 gram helps, but again, it depends on what the cause of the treatment is, cause of the pain is. So though it helps partly, it will not help to completely relieve the pain. Tramadol is something that is available, and if it can be procured for the ambulances, that can help
Yeah,
because of the part opioid or action that it has.
Tramadol is there very much available in, but still somehow I feel that tramadol is not that, there's no match between fentanyl and tramadol. That's what I feel practically when we practice. So
Yes, absolutely.
them to give paracetamol also. Dr. Raveen or anybody, emergency medicine people who wants to ask, I think most of the questions which have been given have been answered by all the speakers, but still if it is missed, I want you to come forward.
Sir, Keshav, sir.
Yeah, tell me, Dr. Keshav.
Sir, actually, we are talking about these onco patients, and I think Madam has recommended tramadol. But as already Madam mentioned, that most of them will be nauseating and vomiting, and also how good would tramadol help? Because again, the side effect being nausea and vomiting.
So I think
that is right, but it depends. You need to assess the severity of the pain. If the patient is having significant pain, is wincing, probably giving a shot of ondansetron and then giving tramadol can be useful rather than not giving anything at all. And definitely you can add some paracetamol, which can be combined. And yeah, it might be helpful.
how is the usage of this diclofenac and all now in this COVID era? Are they completely avoiding it as of before also? They have reduced using diclofenac and Voveron and all those things. Have they reduced? Is the usage of that has come down or still they are using? Dr. Sudha Madam, in your...
So it really depends upon the patient, but generally NSAIDs, if I have to use, I would not use for more than 1 or 2 doses. So in the COVID era, especially if you're suspecting patients for having an infection, then we're definitely not giving NSAIDs. But my scale has been to start with paracetamol. I think that's a very underutilized medicine, but to start with paracetamol. Tramadol is something that is available in all the districts also. If not, moving to morphine.
Okay. Thank you, Doctor. Dr. Raveen, you have any questions? Is he there, Dr. Raveen?
Good evening, sir.
Good evening, Dr. Raveen.
Good evening, ma'am. Just one doubt I have, ma'am. Does radiotherapy have any role in the treatment of COVID, ma'am?
No, not that I'm aware of.
So there has been some article that has been published, but no, it never took mainstream. I think apart from that one article, I haven't seen any literature mentioning that radiation can be a possibility.
Yeah, that's what I've seen, because in some articles I have read, they have been using radiotherapy in the treatment of COVID-19. And ma'am, what is the severity of complications in cancer patients who develop COVID-19? What is the severity of thrombophilia in cancer patients?
So I don't think the risk of thrombophilia is more in cancer patients compared to any other patient who's been diagnosed with COVID. The other question is also, do they get more serious infections, COVID infections, if you have a history of cancer? And there have been actually different studies with different outcomes. So the two questions on, are you at an increased risk of COVID infection because you have cancer? And will you get a worsened infection because you have cancer? And both, I don't think we have a clear-cut answer, but the data does point out that most patients who are receiving active chemotherapy would be considered as low immunity state and at a higher risk of getting the infection. But the recovery rate, I think, would be equivalent to any other patient, which may be slightly higher, but not a big difference.
Because most of the patients...
Yeah, if I wanted to add one more point to what Dr. Raveen had asked, So I think the answer also would get complete if we talk about what type of patient it is. If the patient who's received chemotherapy, there is already marrow suppression where the platelet count is low, there is neutropenia. These are not the patients where you would expect them to go into thrombotic complications. But as rightly pointed out, cancer is a thrombotic situation, and patients who do not have marrow suppression can have thrombotic tendencies. With normal platelet count also, they can have an increased risk of deep vein thrombosis. Even with higher counts, they definitely have a higher risk of deep vein thrombosis. So yes, Clexane should be started for these patients if there is a diagnosis of COVID.
Dr. Vibha, just for my interest, I'm asking now, you are taking the patients for surgery. Are you doing COVID tests for all the patients? Are any, they have, how are you taking the patient for surgery? Suppose you want to post 10 patients for surgery. How are you filtering them?
Yeah. So working in a cancer hospital is exceptionally challenging because on one hand, you have a group of patients who are more susceptible, who also need to be given continued treatment because their disease can progress. And on the other hand, you would have patients who, because of treatment, would have become immunosuppressed and have now been diagnosed as COVID positive. Because they have taken treatment in your hospital for so long, your hospital is going to be the first point of contact that you would want to come. I mean, this I'm saying because earlier we were not allowed, none of the private hospitals were allowed to admit COVID patients. And whenever we had a COVID patient, we had to shift the patient out. But now that we are allowing both, it is very important to keep these two group of patients absolutely separate. So all the patients that come in for surgery, those who walk through the surgical theater, are getting RT-PCR done as well as CT chest done, because we do not want to miss a patient who could be RT-PCR negative but is having COVID lesions in the lung, or who has CT changes because of any other reason. So all surgical cases that come to our OR are tested with RT-PCR
Okay.
as well as CT
Are
chest.
you doing
This is
this?
just to maintain the operation theater area. Absolutely. Yes.
Where are you getting it done? RT-PCR, you're getting in the
So
Basata?
sample collection, yeah, sample collection is done in my hospital. My hospital microbiology lab is not approved, so we are sending the samples outside. We have a tie-up with the 2 lab facilities where we send a sample. The patient gets admitted the previous day morning. Say, suppose tomorrow the surgery is there, today morning the patient gets admitted, RT-PCR swab is sent in the morning, CT chest is done in the afternoon, and we send certain labs, like we do a repeat CBC, we do an LDH level on these patients, and then the report is available next day early morning, and if everything is cleared, we take them up for surgery. If we have, like Sudha madam had mentioned, the CORAD score on CT chest, so we have had couple of patients who were RT-PCR negative, but they had a CORAD score of say 3 or 4. Now, for those who don't know what a CORAD score is a CT chest scoring of the possibility whether this patient could have COVID. And CORAD score of 1 and 2 mean minimal chances that this patient can have COVID. So the cases that we take up for surgery are only the patients who are CORAD 1 and 2. CORAD 3 and 4 are intermediate possibility. For these patients, we actually admit the patient in the hospital, keep them up for 5 or 7 days, repeat their RT-PCR just to see if they were in the window period where we could not pick up their RT-PCR. And then we decide whether we are going to take this patient or not. And CORADs 5 and 6 are immediately moved to the isolation area or COVID ICU.
So now if you suppose you have sent for RT-PCR and the report is not ready and it is an emergency, how do you manage? You send to some other hospital?
Yeah. No. Okay. So if we have an emergency condition, like there is say intestinal obstruction that cannot wait because there is a perforation, or if we are expecting some bowel gangrene, then these patients, or there's a big bleeding tumor, or even tracheostomies. So for these patients, it depends on the time that you have, that you may be able to send an RT-PCR or you may not even be able to send an RT-PCR, particularly tracheostomies who come in very breathless. So there is a designated OR where this patient goes. There is a designated flow of the patient that is earmarked for these patients, and everybody wears full PPE, and the entire path that the patient has taken is again re-sterilized so that it can be used again for other patients.
Have you made one negative pressure theater?
Including a designated lift, cleaning of the lift? No, we don't.
No, don't have
We
negative.
don't. We have HEPA filters. We do not have a negative pressure operating theater, but we have very good cycle changes. So almost 12 to 15 operation room air cycle changes is what we have, and that should be adequate.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Vibha. Dr. Ramana Rao, you want to ask anything else?
Just wanted to thank them profusely because myriad of very important topics and their answers were given to us in a very simple, lucid manner. Sure that it has benefited particularly those EMTs who are struggling and trying to help the patients. Now we are having a lot of challenges in inter-facility transfers. So today group, I find some students from EMTs from Uttar Pradesh, they are involved with 2 to 3 hours, sometimes 4 hours of transfer from a lower level hospital to the higher level hospital or a secondary to a tertiary care center, right? So for all of these people, you have left some very key messages, and I'm touched with the way Dr. Sudha has mentioned about the grief counseling, which most of our EMTs will face once in 4 days or 5 days. Those tips are very valid, and the newer devices, what Doctor from LV Prasad, Prardhana has mentioned, is very, very pertinent, and it looks to be a very big teacher in Dr. Vibha, and you're adding value to each of these questions is something very brilliant, and we were all happy about the way the things have gone and in the last 2 hours, and it was a phenomenal learning experience. Raja, thank you so much for bringing up this. I have seen in Indigo the girl power right here. I see you have put a panelist of women senior clinicians. It itself is another, I would say that another feather in this panel discussions, what we have been running as a series, right? So
thank you. Why I involved
COVID related points also, right? That's all on my side. Thank you, Dr. Raja.
Thank you, Dr. Ramana. Why I involved these 3 doctors is these 3 doctors are very dynamic. They work hard, and still in the COVID period, I'm seeing them working so hard, and they have a lot of teaching knowledge and interested in all these things. So that is the reason why I requested Dr. Sudha, Dr. Vibha, and Dr. Prardhana to be here for this webinar. Thank you.
Dr. Raja, why don't you ask everybody to unmute and clap for our panelists today? Because this is what you mentioned, right?
I have unmuted all, but they have to unmute themselves. I have unmuted all.
At least from my side, I'll clap.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Sudha, Dr. Prardhana. Thanks a lot to be here. All Dr. Ramana Rao, our director, and all the participants who are here. Actually, the number of participants, what you are seeing is very less, but we are also YouTube, so many of them may be. So thank you again, and we may be disturbing you again after 1 or 2 months to see what changes have happened. Thank you, madam. Thank you, Dr. Sudha. Thank you, Dr.
Yeah, sure, sir. Thank you so much.
Vibha and Dr. Prardhana. Thank you.
Thank you so much.